It is my pleasure to welcome back this morning friend, colleague, mentor, and muse, the indispensable Andrew Weiner. Andrew is the author of the novels The Marriage Artist and The Color Midnight Maid. He also writes and speaks about art, religion, literature, and philosophy, and conducts conversations with fellow authors, most recently for this museum, Colm Tóibín, Jeff Dyer, and Adam Zagajewski. He is chair of creative writing at the University of California, Riverside, and a recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in Fiction. You will remember, of course, that he has spoken to us twice before, the first time on Valeska Suarez and the second on Martin Johnson Head. A hybrid artist himself, he is particularly well suited in helping us to understand how we are to regard the artist who writes or the writer who makes art. His subject today, Marsden Hartley, whose work, Alpspitz Mittenwald Road, is currently on view in Let It Snow, is one such artist who divided his time between poetry in the morning and painting in the afternoon. Just as with Head, with Hartley, we are examining ways of seeing and perception, and as we dig deeper into the precision of his simplicity, we feel his role as an outsider looking in. He too, as with Valeska Suarez, embodies the push-pull of loss and love, the seemingly contradictory mystery, as he expressed, that you don't see a thing until you look away from it, and that in isolation can be found a deep, revealing place of home. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Weiner back to this stage as we explore the livingness of appearances in the poetry and painting of Marsden Hartley.
Good morning. It's nice to be here again. Thank you, Patsy, and Luna and everyone who assisted with this presentation. Hartley is... yeah, can you not hear me? Yeah, let me try this. How's that? Is that any better? Higher. Higher? Okay.
Physically higher.
Yeah, not sure if I can do that. We'll see. See what happens here. Let's try this.
I put this mic on so it should be picking it off.
Oh, the whole thing comes up. How's this? Can you hear me? Yeah. I was amazed and impressed that the museum has two Marsden Hartleys, and not just the quantity, but the quality of both pieces, including this one. I thought I'd start with a picture of Marsden and some quotes by writers that inspired him, and he's an unusual case. Artists often read and drew inspiration from other writers, but he was a case of taking more than just kind of inspiration from what he read. He took a sort of faith from what he read, and also he absorbed it as a writer himself, not just as a painter. George Santayana, who was how many of you know who Santayana was? Has anybody ever? Yeah. He was at Harvard at the turn of the century, a very important American philosopher. Art, like life, should be free, since both are experimental. And I love that idea of life as a risky, unknown thing, an experiment. And clearly Marsden did too, for reasons that we'll kind of understand in a moment. And then Plotinus, who was the great Latin Platonist, who wrote about Plato. better than probably anyone ever did. And Hartley was constantly reading Plotinus. And, well, let me just read it. "We must close our eyes and invoke a new manner of seeing, a wakefulness that is the birthright of us all, though few put it to use." And then finally, Sainte Thérèse of Lisieux, who very important nun, who, among other things, "I understood that love comprises all vocations." Again, an important quote for our friend Marsden Hartley. Hartley's is a story of a person discovering himself. To discover yourself. Sometimes this is achieved only formally in our lives, right? We discover a vocation or a skill. But to discover yourself fully, I argue, is to find freedom. And until this discovery is made, all freedom is frivolity. And one of the ways that Hartley discovered himself was socially. He came from a very straitened rural background in down east in Maine. And but he ended up going to the centers of culture in Europe and also in New York. This is a picture of him in Paris with Ezra Pound and Ferdinand Léger. He's on the left there, and that's Pound in the middle. And he also ended up, does anybody know who this is? Gertrude Stein, yeah. How can we not know? Look at that look. So Marsden very quickly found his way, from a small town boy, he was suddenly a fixture in Gertrude Stein's apartment. And if we know anything about that apartment, it's where modernism really found a home, both in the modernists themselves, but also in the work. Very famously, she had Picasso's portrait of her kind of featured on one of her walls, among all the other greats. And so there was Marsden suddenly hanging out there, and Marsden knew how to talk. He could schmooze with the best of them, but in her salon, he was absolutely silent. He was just so stunned to be there. And then the most important kind of social connection that he made was with this fellow. Who knows who this is? Stieglitz, yeah. Alfred Stieglitz, yeah. Stieglitz, so Marsden comes down, I say Marsden because I feel so close to him that he's my buddy, right? It's the same way I feel about Henry James. So Marsden had an introduction to Stieglitz, and he shows up at Stieglitz's kind of his little room off of his gallery to meet him for the first time. And I thought I'd read to you from Hartley's autobiography a little bit of that meeting. "We went up in a little dinky elevator run by a West Indian named Hodge, who was to endear himself to all of us later on, and entered the small brownish room, and there was the man who would be a figure in my life over a long period in a strictly human way. Never without his glasses, a kind of nervous, half-rag, half-homespun sort of person, with a stern and drawn look in his eye, and great absorption in the sober things of life." And what Hartley means by that is in the correspondence, the extensive correspondence with Stieglitz that Hartley engaged in from Europe. Stieglitz gave him some money to go to Europe. He's always asking, Hartley's in each letter is pressing Stieglitz for money. And Stieglitz writes back these kind of harassed and harried letters telling him, he keeps saying to him, "I must give you a reality check. You must know what the facts are." And he gives him figures and money. And Hartley always responds, "I can't look at the figures. It's too emotional, So it was this funny relationship. In addition to being the figure truly in American modernism, the person who begun the whole kind of modernist movement in New York, in America, Stieglitz was a manager of many different difficult personalities, the artists in his salon, in his gallery. But with all, Hartley writes, he continues, but with all that came a lovely sense of humor leaning toward the sardonic, a flair for horse racing, billiards, music, and good literature. And he was the inventor of modern photography. So kind of lovely note there. Hartley also discovered himself with the men he met in Paris, Berlin, and later in Maine. Yet despite his fervent socializing in New York and the centers of Europe, Hartley always retreated. He always found home in isolation, whether it was a kind of a physical isolation in the solitude of the Alps, where he ended up moving to and painting for, importantly, or in Nova Scotia, where he found a family to live with later in his life, or in the mountains of New England, which we'll talk about in a moment. Or he found emotional isolation, where even in a crowd of artists and kind of cultural people, he was more an observer or a voyeur than a participant. He was always kind of on the outside looking in, and I think we'll come to understand that in a moment. And he says as much in his autobiography, I know how much I have missed by not being the actor in life, but I have not failed as the spectator, and that is my particular heritage. So he was very self-aware of this idea of being an observer rather than an actor in life. This is a key moment in Hartley's life. Constitutionally, he kind of had the soul and the hunger of a mystic, Marsden Hartley. Part of that in his youth, he attended spiritualist camps in Maine, and he comes from these deeply religious Puritan roots. And that kind of made him predisposed to be drawn to someone like Blake's poetry, for example, William Blake, the spiritualist art of William Blake. But it also set him up to have a momentous encounter with a painter who would become his favorite and happens to be one of my favorite American artists as well. Does anybody know who painted that painting? Yeah, Albert Pinkham Ryder, exactly. And this is a photo of Hartley at the time that he discovered Albert Pinkham Ryder. He had a meeting with a dealer who owned this particular painting, and he didn't know of Ryder at all. And so he was sitting there in the salon of this dealer, and the dealer kind of knew that this was going to be a moment. And he brings out this little painting just in his hands, and he just places it in Hartley's lap. And Hartley has this moment, and I want to read to you his account of this encounter with Ryder. It was a picture that so affected me that in all truth I was never the same after the first moment. For the power that was in it shook the rafters of my being and left me sort of shaking in the force of the wind. This picture was a marine by Albert Ryder. Just some sea, some clouds, and a sailboat on the tossing waters. It had in it the stupendous solemnity of a Blake mystical picture, and it had a sense of realism besides that bore such a force of nature itself as to leave me breathless, as if I had read a page of the Bible. I was a convert into the field of imagination into which I was born. Yeah. Hartley was drawn to religious writers, including Eliot, who wrote, "Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to care and not to care." Hartley's was a spiritual longing, if there ever was one, but also perhaps a defense against the terrors of his childhood, his oversized need to be loved, and his mistrust of love when it came. Why was he so drawn to the mystic sense of certainty? There goes my notes. Sorry. This is an attraction that I well understand myself. I've spent my entire adult life reading those who are certain, religiously certain, without having that certainty myself. What I would say is that there's comfort in knowing that others know, even if you don't, and a hope that they might be right. But he was too rooted in this world to be a true mystic. Marsden, our friend Marsden, he couldn't bring himself to embrace any given dogma or faith or credo. He knew himself too well. He knew what freedom might feel like, even if he hadn't completely found it. But nevertheless, he read Plotinus, Thoreau, Emerson. I would say he was a qualified transcendentalist. He understood that one shouldn't love the earth at the expense of the world. If you know what I mean, here's what I mean. Intuitively and intellectually, he had what his hero, Miguel de Unamuno, called a tragic sense of life. He agreed with de Unamuno's assertion that everything vital is anti-rational. Everything vital is anti-rational, not merely irrational. And that everything rational is anti-vital. He drew much from nature, but he was too spiritual to believe in naturalism. And he loved what humans could do too much. He knew that all the most valuable things in life are the great concrete human achievements, and not abstractions or the gifts of nature. And yet he did finally find God. And here's where he found it. Mount Katahdin in Maine. Has anybody ever been there who's here in the audience? Yeah. This was a late painting of Katahdin. And here we see some of this kind of homespun, almost a homespun feel, almost a childish kind of quality to the clouds, right? To even the way the lake is drawn. And yet there's nothing childish about the blackness of Katahdin, the imposing, and the kind of contrast with this almost fiery foreground. What's the connection between his spirituality and his art? The answer lies, I say, in the calling that artists and writers feel. A calling to be affectively, which is to say emotionally responsive to what the world discloses to us. And I would say it's a love-hate relationship that any serious artist feels toward the world. With the emphasis, however submerged and however painful, necessarily on the love part. An artist is called to love life as she might a god. Creatively, thoughtfully, reverently, and sometimes irreverently. And more than anything, doing all the work. But what about the hate part? I say that too emerges from the calling to love life, actually, but rather to love it as we might love a person. Understanding that our ability to be in it will eventually end. Learning what its problems are. Ultimately knowing everything difficult about it, and yet building on those difficulties, changing ourselves because of them, and because of our aspiration for something better, greater, and nobler. What were the problems of life for Marsden Hartley? His beloved Plotinus, life is the flight of the alone to the alone. A cheerful phrase for us in the morning. It reminds me of the Venerable Bede's incredible and forever image of the bird flying through the hall in winter, right? From the cold outside into the warm hall and then back out again. That's our life. One answer is that the problem of life for Hartley was certainly a spiritual one, as I've alluded to. The other is that it was existential and circumstantial, starting with his mother dying when he was 9. I'd like to read in his own words, because they're so beautiful, what he says about that. I have only a photograph that tells me that she had tender eyes and a large mouth, with her hair braided and coiled about her head, one curl hanging down over her shoulder. And I want to say that it's only a writer, and perhaps only an artist, that would notice that curl hanging down over her shoulder. And the look of much maternal travail. I see her most faintly in her last illness, sitting in a chair, for she could not lie down. An incredible detail, seems to me. I remember nothing else, though I suspect I was haunted by this image and probably the callings from the void. Hartley was tall and later very large because of his proclivity to eat too much. He was awkward. He was eagle-like in his profile. He came from Lewiston by way of Cleveland, having survived truly a Dickensian childhood that included not just the death of his mother, but the abandonment by his father, and incredible poverty that required him to leave school at 15 and work in a shoe factory. He was also gay, and he knew it. My childhood, he wrote, was vast with terror and surprise. And a cryptic statement, if there ever was one, I think, from him. He was always reticent to speak about his childhood. There's some real understatement in that phrase. There's a timeline of his life in a book about him that I thought illustrates things quite well. 1892, leaves school to work in a Lewiston shoe factory. 1893, joins family in Cleveland and works in a marble quarry office. 1896, takes art classes from John Saman, a Cleveland painter. 1898, takes a painting trip with Saman and loses his quarry job. Sorry. And here we are. I wanted to show you kind of what he looked like at the time we're talking about here. His hero Santayana writes, I opened my eyes on the world with the conviction that it was inhuman, not meant for man, but habitable by him. And Hartley himself wrote, I am lost only when the moments to which my own life is such a stranger descend upon me so thickly as to make me see all things and all people with an objectivity which is after all pure horror. But there's a courage in this, isn't there? A refusal to look away. He nevertheless had designs on this world, and he reminds one of Camus' assessment of life. Camus writes, no tragedy, no history, consummately inhuman. It is a world for courage. This was one of Hartley's first still lifes. He's obviously encountered Matisse. Yeah. I'm not sure if any of you got to see the remarkable show of Matisse in San Francisco when he was paired with Diebenkorn. But there was a painting in the show that I'm almost certain was the inspiration for this one by Hartley. And though this is so early and perhaps you could say derivative, I think it's a remarkable painting. I love this painting. And I think it shows Marsden, I keep using his first name, forgive me, Hartley, to already be America's first and most important modernist painter. he goes with the money from Stieglitz that I mentioned earlier, and from a dealer. He goes to Paris, and then he finds his way to Munich, where he meets Kandinsky and Franz Marc, the kind of founders of the Die Blaue Reiter group, the Blue Riders, which is one of, at the time we're talking about, one of the most important groups, along with the secessionists and what was going on up in France. So we see Kandinsky's ideas, and Franz Marc's too, and the other Blaue Reiter painters, in this painting called The Warriors. I'm sorry, yeah. It is The Warriors, yeah. This was a portrait. Can anybody guess who it's a portrait of? No. Here's a hint. One portrait of one woman. It's Gertrude Stein. Yeah. But I think one of his achievements, pardon me, one of his achievements early on here in Europe on this very first trip is to employ the language of abstraction in figurative work. Right? The Cubists were kind of having their moment, but Hartley has a distinctive. He was very derisive toward Braque, for example, who he thought was just a copycat of Picasso. And as much as Hartley really did feel Picasso was the absolute greatest artist of his time, to his credit, Hartley doesn't mimic Picasso. He goes his own way, and I think we see that here. This is a Bermuda window in a semi-tropic character, 1917. And I think we do see Matisse here a bit in this, don't we? Some of the paintings, perhaps, that Matisse did down in Coulières, on the coast there. But more importantly, I think one of the most important paintings Hartley ever did in the series that he did, which you've seen, no doubt, this portrait of a German officer. And this is a quote, this is one of Hartley's most favorite quotes. He uses it in a book he wrote. "Keep in your soul some images of magnificence." I thought it was very apposite regarding the paintings of pageantry and insignia that Hartley found himself doing when he moves to Berlin. What year is this? It's 19. He moves there, I guess, in 1917. I want to say. It's the height of the Kaiser is. If you lived in Berlin, you were forever seeing parades of soldiers coming down Unter den Linden Strasse, right? And for Hartley, who loved men, this was an ideal place to be situated because you not only had beautiful men on their horses, but they were dressed in shiny boots and helmets and incredible, lots of shiny trinkets hanging from them, a lot of beautiful accoutrements, right? And there was this sense, this was 19, I had it wrong. This was 1914, so it's right before the war Hartley gets there. Perhaps even late 1913. There's this obsession that he has with, the surface of militarism, right? That's highly sexualized and erotic, and filled with desire. And he was focused on one particular German in particular, a man named Freiberg, who by all accounts was a beautiful and kind of man with a kind of certain nobility of spirit. And I wanted to read you Hartley's own words about Freiberg, because As soon as the war starts, Freiberg goes off to, like all the other men did, happily to war, and he's promptly killed. And here's what Hartley says. He's writing to Stieglitz. If you knew Freiberg, you would understand what true pathos is. There never was anywhere a man more beloved and more necessary to the social well-being of the world. It's a remarkable statement, I think, actually. In every way a perfect being, physically, spiritually, and mentally beautifully balanced, 24 years young, and of all things necessary. Love that use of necessary. It seems like a great lie I am always telling when I say that I have to accept the truth of Freiberg's death. You know what friendships are to me, Stieglitz, how slowly I make them, and when once made, how I almost worship them. And we see here, we hear the pain of Hartley's life, of his childhood, of his losses, of his isolation, and what connections do mean to him when he finally makes them. I had every reason in this wide world to adore the fellow, perfectly equipped for a life of joy and strength and beauty, most exceptionally handsome, with that rarest accompaniment of soul and character which one finds so often lacking in just beauty. For many weeks I could not do anything. As for me, these things take away terribly from my life energy. I live too deeply in them, for friendship is for me the only notion of the marriage state. So, and we have to, of course, read this for what it was, which was him, talking to Stieglitz about his relationships with men. This was painting number 48 in Berlin, and part of a continuation of the site of kind of the valorization of pageantry. A new person is an event to me, writes his hero Emerson. I want to talk about Emerson in a moment. And hinders me from sleep. I just love that. As a kind of, if there was ever a way to, as a portrayal of what it meant to him to actually have an encounter with someone. When he first, a friend of his, a woman, puts Emerson's essays in Hartley's hands when he's still in New York, and it changes his life. And he brings Emerson's essays with him. He carries them on his person at all times. And he just pulls the essays out and reads them, and he says, I read them as if they were religious mantras or liturgy, almost. Yeah. So we're starting to talk about the difficulties of life, and I thought I'd quote from a letter to Stieglitz. I am finding life a lacking thing. There is a wrong in it. For there is an evasion of purpose, not on my part, but on the part of life. And this takes us back, of course, to Santayana's statements and Camus'. It's a critique of life itself. Nature has equipped me with too much that is human, and life finds it diverting to evade the main issues, and to stand like an acolyte, swinging censers of praise upon the great ceremony of existence as it passes. Well, it is not enough. That is all. There is no recompense for all this. So here's his condemnation, right? His criticism. One must have an incentive more than the mere will to live. And we see here that Hartley is every bit the writer that he was the painter, right? To the problem of life, he understood at a preternaturally young age, actually, that seeing, perception, is perhaps the only recourse one might have, the only solution to these problems. Sorry, I didn't mean to go there. Santayana wrote, when a person realizes his or her own insignificance, by that act, he or she becomes more than insignificant. And after he goes to Europe twice, and the second time in Europe, Hartley he moves to Provence, and he spends a year painting the mountains of Provence. In preparation for a show that the proceeds from which he's in desperate need of, back in New York. And the problem is that the paintings are too realistic, at least by the standards of the collectors and the critics in New York. And so the show is a massive failure. He doesn't sell a single painting. And he has no choice but to return to America. He'd been avoiding coming back. But he makes his way up to Gloucester. Those of you who are, been to Gloucester, we think of it, of course, nowadays. We think of Edward Hopper, for example, don't we? We think of being up on the bluff of Gloucester, looking out over the harbor and the homes up there. But behind the bluffs of Gloucester was and is this kind of abandoned, very old community that was begun in the mid-19th century called Dogtown. And Dogtown, by the time Hartley gets there, is a set of ruins, essentially, no one living there. Among some of the most remarkable boulders to be found in North America. And Hartley finds his new home in this kind of isolation of Dogtown. And he writes to, and this is one of the paintings, by the way, of Dogtown. It's called Dogtown 1930-31. Things exist in their own right, he writes. It is a lesson that escapes us except as they hold us in awe. And he writes about Dogtown what he might have written about himself. He writes, it is forsaken and majestically lovely, as if nature had at last formed one spot where she can live for herself alone. This was always his kind of fallback, was to retreat and live alone, even when he was among others. In these paintings, we see Hartley's identification with other modernists like William Carlos Williams and Wallace Stevens, both of whom essentially said almost the exact same thing. Stevens wrote, very famously, not ideas about the thing, but the thing itself. And one can't help but think of Rilke's breakthrough with his imagistic poems, right? And many others, in fact. And Williams, really the other great modernist of the time, writes, no ideas but in things. But Hartley also seemed to channel Wittgenstein's famous dictum, in German, wovon man nicht sprechen kann, davon muss man schweigen. And, what we can't speak about, we must remain silent. We must pass over in silence. And what Wittgenstein meant by that was that we can't write a report on a podium. It's not accurate. It's not truthful. We have to express the podium if we do anything at all. Otherwise, we don't do anything at all. Many people have misinterpreted Wittgenstein's statement as a denial of meaning, but that's not correct. And as with Wittgenstein, Hartley found a kind of faith in this, in the act of trying to express a thing. Right? This was one of his early paintings of Dogtown. And I want to read from Santayana again. The spirit or energy of the world is what is acting in us, as the sea is what it rises in every little wave. But it passes through us, and cry out as we may, it will move on. Our privilege is to have perceived it as it moves. I love this idea of Santayana's that I think Hartley imbibed, which was that we really are only, at best, creatively and otherwise, even as perceivers, we see things in flickers as they pass. They don't stay fixed, and it's an interesting position to be as a painter, where you're trafficking in the plastic arts, where you are trying to kind of solidify something, and there is a solidity, of course, to Hartley's work. This is White Church. And his Plotinus. I am striving to give back the divine in myself to the divine in the all. So Hartley's he's got Plotinus with him in Dogtown as he's making these paintings, and he often would write on the back of his canvases these quotes. A contemporary in France, though he didn't know it, of Hartley, born slightly later, was Simone Weil. Who had a similar kind of faith that might illuminate Hartley's, if we consider it for a moment. They basically she said, not to see God in things, but that through us, God sees the things that we see. Okay? I'll try to unpack that. In other words, we can think of ourselves as somehow coming out from God toward things. That is, with God as subject, looking at the world and at things with us and through us. All right, so we're not looking for God in a rock. We're looking almost as God at the rock. Right? And so we become, in Simone Weil's vision, something between subject and object, if that makes sense. Something between subject and object. And this very much mirrors Hartley's desire. He says, I wish to paint that thing which exists between me and the object. Another Dogtown painting, this one called Blueberry Highway. So seeing, the act of seeing, is this path between nature and the soul, between object and subject. And I can't help but think of Emerson's transparent eyeball, right? This kind of all-seeing eyeball that goes through the yard in Harvard Yard there. And Emerson actually said, it's a very famous quote, but I think it applies to Hartley and to any serious artist, actually. One should strive for an original relation to the universe, not a novel one, just one's own. And Hartley really did feel that the act of reading, writing, and painting gave significance to the modern world. And I'm reminded there, too, of Hans Castorp and Mann's Magic Mountain, who had this idea that when we read and write and when we think, it's kind of our way of tending to the world. I think Mann used the word, the phrase that it was our sovereignty. To read and to write was our sovereignty. Yeah. I think it's helpful because Hartley read so much De Unamuno. Do people know who De Unamuno is? Are you familiar with him? He's the most important Spanish thinker around the turn of the century, right? The turn of the 19th into the 20th. De Unamuno was a heartbroken kind of disbeliever. He, like others of his time, including his counterpart in Portugal, Pessoa, he was born of parents who kind of lost their faith, or parents who had faith, and then they inherit a modern kind of secular nihilistic world, but they still have this kind of hunger for that which we might call spiritual, but they don't have any means or methods, at least that seem to be culturally available. So they're looking at life in this kind of new way, really. And De Unamuno writes, The vanity of the passing world and love are the two fundamental and heart-penetrating notes of true poetry. Have I said that Hartley was a poet? I think we have, yeah. And there are two notes of which neither can be sounded without causing the other to vibrate. So love and the vanity of ephemerality, right? The feeling of the vanity of the passing world kindles love in us, the only thing that triumphs over the vain and the transitory, the only thing that fills life again and eternalizes it. And love, above all when it struggles against destiny, overwhelms us with the feeling of the vanity of this world of appearances and gives us a glimpse of another world in which destiny is overcome and liberty is law. And one of the reasons I chose this passage, because I know Hartley read it, is those last three words, liberty is law. In love, liberty is law. And I think that Hartley was forever trying to liberate himself. Here we go. These are remarkable paintings. I'm not sure. Have you seen his paintings of men? Yeah. They almost virtually throb with kind of the equivalent of life itself, don't they? There's obviously a kind of a chord of the sexual, but also, I would argue, of the spiritual. And at the same time, this kind of urbane or kind of quality, and yet this homegrown folk aspect. So there's this contrast, the tragic and the ecstatic at the same time, right? The difference, Santayana writes, between the life of the spirit and that of the flesh is itself a spiritual difference. The two are not to be divided materially so much as in the quality of their attention. The one is anxiety, inquiry, desire, and fear, right? So that's the flesh. The other is intuitive possession. The spirit is not a talebearer having a mock world of its own to substitute for the humble circumstances of this life. So that's a criticism of the Christian kind of otherworldly position, right? This world is no good, so we throw our lot in with the other world. It is only the faculty, the disenchanting and the re-enchanting faculty of seeing this world in its simple truth. The pure spiritual life cannot be something compensatory, a consolation for having missed some solid satisfactions. It should be rather the flower of all satisfactions. And I read this and I think of Hartley in Nova Scotia, for example, where he lived with these incredible men who were fishermen and these beautiful young men and their family. And there was sexual congress happening up there for him and for them. And yet, so he was very much, he had a voluptuous hungers, Hartley, but he also had this spiritual, and I don't think they were separate things. I think that Santayana helped him to understand this. It is not with love or with pity that we understand everything. It is with pure perception, clean insight into what makes the movements of every man, any man, his movements. And now we're returned to how I began today's talk, with this idea of discovery and that the real liberation of discovering oneself only comes when it isn't just discovering your vocation, but truly inhabiting yourself. And I think, when Hartley he was actually painting, the funny thing is he was actually painting these to be hung up in a gym, a school gym. Which I just love. I mean, for a man of such perception, he was so naive in a way. Can you imagine a high school gym with these paintings? I've always said that you do not see a thing until you look away from it. Yeah. And this is really crucial, and it kind of represents a turn in what I want to say to you. This problem of kind of... let me read you his full quote. I'm sorry. Let's go back. Let me read you his full quote about that. I have always said that you do not see a thing until you look away from it. In other words, an object or a fact in nature has not become itself until it has been projected in the realm of the imagination. Therefore, what has been retained in the mind's eye is what lives. I have seldom or never worked from nature for this reason. And so what I see is what I believe to be true. And that becomes the truism of the creative writer and the creative artist. The details, this is really key, the details, the prose of nature, the artist should omit. Right? The prose of nature should be omitted. And give us only the spirit and splendor. He should know that the landscape has beauty for his eye because it expresses a thought which is good to him. One of my favorite paintings by Hartley is this one called Mexico Recollection. Right? He paints this retrospectively, right? The real visionary, he says, is beyond any help that nature can offer her. She transposes facts into her spiritual transports and arranges a harmony of them for us, and the farther she sees, often the less comprehensive it is. And so I love the last part of this line. It's really important. It's a kind of a key insight into modernism, I would say, but also even into contemporary ideas of what constitutes serious works of art and writing, is the elimination of so much, right? The elimination. It's the opposite of a compendious approach to the world. It's about selection and depth and eschewing of the prose of life, as he says. But the other problem for Hartley that we really haven't talked about was and is truth itself. Truth was a value for him, but there are problems. And now we go to Emerson, his beloved Emerson. The breadth of the problem is great. And this is from Emerson's, one of his greatest essays called The Poet. Perhaps you know some of this. For the poet is representative. In other words, representative of all of us. He or she stands among partial men for the complete man and apprises us not of his wealth, but of the commonwealth, says Emerson. For all men live by truth and stand in need of expression. In love and art and avarice and politics and labor and games, we study to utter our painful secret. The man is only half himself, the other half is his expression. Adequate expression is rare. I know not how it is that we need an interpreter, but the great majority of men seem to be mutes who cannot report the conversation they have had with nature. Incredible. These days, the way that essays are taught is just so criminal. The so-called 5-paragraph essay that is taught in every school. And I always tell my students that I tell them it is a crime that they've been taught that. And I put the poet in their hands, and I just tell them to read. Too feeble fall the impressions of nature on us to make us artists. Do you see the resonance here with Hartley's idea that nature doesn't just present us with everything, that there's this perception is the activity, the all-important activity. Every touch should thrill. Every man should be so much an artist that he could report in conversation what had befallen him. But what kind of truth? I'm asking. And Emerson, after all, wrote that grief, too, will make us idealists. Right? It's this idea that grief, our being in this world that seems uninhabitable or inhospitable, to us, makes us to survive and to continue to live, idealists. And Nietzsche, the philosopher, actually warned that truth at all costs is extremely harmful to us. Okay? It can harm us irreparably, in fact. So Hartley says, I think perhaps one takes the notion of truth too seriously. Perhaps the highest truth is only a lie, after all. These late paintings of delicate things he found on the beach in Gloucester are, I think, just remarkable, stunning paintings. Truth is only believed when someone has invented it well, Santayana wrote. Yeah. Another Dogtown painting. Things truly perceived, writes Hartley, are old and new and ageless. This is the wonder of them. And he says, I want to paint the livingness of appearances. You know, part of the answer to the problem of truth for Hartley, I think, lay in his being enamored of life, painful as it was. Part of that courage, right? But the other part lay in how he told the truth in his work. And again, we have these kind of, you know, it's almost as if the 9-year-old Hartley were painting through the soul of an adult's kind of pain and experience, right? Having absorbed the whole of modernism on the way and arrived at his own language. But the important thing I think I want to say is that he was more interested in how things felt than how they looked. You know, what's this painting called? Night Watch, yeah. And as I kind of close my talk, I wanted to read you a couple things that Hartley wrote, because his writing about art is unparalleled. Some of the finest thinking. Stieglitz knew, just from the letters, that Hartley's ideas about art were some of the greatest he'd ever seen, and he encouraged Hartley to start writing essays about art. And here's a bit that he wrote about the Night Watch. I'm going to read it to you. What a tempo of order and well-being pouring out of this huge picture, Hartley writes. Symbol of all that direct living is meant to be. Ordered things calmly chanting satisfaction. Surging down out of all this ambered unity. He's a poet, right? The idea that life itself is above all human machination. Rembrandt, glorifier of living essences. One clear symphonized declaration of life in the continual replenishment of itself. The huge problem involved of producing so completely unified a picture. Nothing is personal. This is phenomenal thinking about a picture, and about what his craft is, and about what a painter does and what a writer does. The other painting that perhaps was even more important to Hartley than Albert Pinkham Ryder's Marine was this one by Durer, right? Self-Portrait. An incredible painting. Has anybody seen this in person? Yeah. Listen to Hartley on this one. And this is I also chose this because we're in a museum. I went to the museum today only because it is my language. And it is well every now and then to give a good eye sweep over a museum. The docents. Just to recall the different ways of speaking the language. Just to recall the different ways of speaking the language. And I sense this whenever I walk into a museum, which is quite often, that I am reacquainting myself with language, right? Hartley continues, I am feeling that way about the self-portrait of Albert Durer, all around the best portrait that has ever been done by anyone at any time. Never have I seen such eyes in a painting. for they seem to roll from side to side as you look into them. I would like to make a painting of a mountain and have it have all that this portrait has. Yeah. And I wanted to end on a poem, naturally, of Hartley's, to the Nameless One. And this was written at the end of his life. You who have power over everything obscure, listen, come over here, sit by my side, and let me say the things I want to say. I want nothing in the way of artificial heavens. The earth is all I know of wonder. I lived and was nurtured in the magic of dreams, bright flames of spirit laughter around all my seething frame. Yeah. Thank you. I just want to add that it's important. It's very important that he ends with my seething frame. He ends with the body, doesn't he? Yeah. Yeah. We can do a few questions if I may be able to answer. Yeah.
He said of himself he doesn't actually paint from nature. I mean, he wasn't a plein air.
He refused to do plein air painting.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
He did all that in the studio from the memory.
Well, he would spend whole days out in nature, and he would do what he called memory paintings, which were very quick little memory paintings, the way that someone like Turner or Constable used to do. And then he would go back to the studio, which was actually Albert Pinkham Ryder's method as well. They would go out into... Ryder had to be in a dark, artificially lit, messy studio. It's so funny because Hartley was fastidious of his person, despite his being quite overweight and things like this. He was tidy, and the first time he went to his hero's studio, Albert Pinkham Ryder's, it was trash up to the ceiling and just a path through the studio. And the path went to the easel where Ryder made his paintings, and then 10 feet to a window that Ryder, so he could get some air. And then to another path to the bed, and that was it. You could imagine how horrified Hartley was, but he was also in awe because this was the greatest American painter he felt. He thought that Ryder was much greater than Sargent or Whistler or any of these other guys. So, any of the Hudson School painters as well. Other questions? Yeah.
Just in response to what Julie said, that her comment in the sketching and then going back to his studio, drawing from his memory, kind of underscores the spiritual nature of his relationship with art, in that it's not about the object itself, it's about the perception of the art. So what it really looked like didn't matter, that it was his sort of spiritual experience that was important to convey.
Yeah, and it's that idea of what's between us and things. Right? Thank you. Yeah. It's a still life, a beautiful still life, gorgeous.